So, this is Measure and Tempo with Vit de Groot. I am Vit de Groot, that's the easy part of the class. Measure and Tempo are something else. I like to start this class with a couple of disclaimers, 2 or 3 of them. Disclaimer number 1, everything that I will teach here today is wrong. It is demonstrably and factually incorrect. Please don't leave yet because it leads us to disclaimer number 2. What I mean by it's wrong is that if you go through a bunch of old books and you look for old masters who are saying what I'm saying, you will not find them. This is not the Measure and Tempo of Degrassi. This is not the Measure and Tempo of Fabris. Those I consider to be, instead of intro, those are advanced Measure and Tempo because they're focusing on a specific skill set. When I say disclaimer number 2, everything I teach here is absolutely true. And the idea is, so I've read a bunch of these old books, and I said I'm looking at Measure and Tempo, and instead of reading the Measure and Tempo of Degrassi or the Measure and Tempo of whoever, I'm looking for the common threads, the things that they all seem to agree on, those fundamental issues that everybody says, do this and it works. Disclaimer number 3, don't try to apply this stuff today. This is something that if you really start thinking about it hard in a tournament, your brain will kind of lock up. You'll try to figure out how the centipede walks. This is something that I want to plant as seeds in your head so that you start thinking about it a little bit during practice. This is something that took me a couple of years to learn. Most fencers learn this instinctually after a while. My idea is to jumpstart the learning curve from being a several years long process to being a, oh, now it makes sense process. I've talked to people who are really, really great fighters who said, you know, I've been doing this for years, but I never knew what I was doing or why. And that's kind of what this class is about. So those are my disclaimers. I describe this class as being, or not this class, Measure and Tempo, as being essential and fundamental. This is not a redundancy on my part. I consider these to be 2 separate things. Essential means really, really important. Fundamental means it's at the core of the issue and has nothing to do with school. My favorite example of this is footwork. Footwork is essential. It is not fundamental. If you take Fiore, he says footwork. All right, your footwork should be the footwork of the elephant. Not slow and plodding, but centered, focused. You cannot be knocked over. You meet force with force. You are there. All right, that's good footwork, and it works. If you take the footwork of Agrippa, especially in the narrow stances, it is the footwork of a spear. You are balanced on a single point. You are on the cusp of falling over. You are ready to tip at any time. These are diametrically opposed viewpoints. Therefore, footwork cannot be fundamental. It can't be foundational. It has to be just important. Foundational, you have to go to what engineers call first principles. It has to be things that transcend schools. Time, space, geometry, all that stuff. And that's what this class is about. It's about measure and tempo. Measure and tempo translate roughly from the Italian as distance and time. I am not a language fetishist. I do not believe that you fence better in Italian. I believe that knowing Italian means that you spend a lot of time learning Italian that you could have spent learning English. And so I try to use plain English language to describe these concepts. So why do I say measure and tempo? And the reason is because if I said I'm teaching a class on distance and time, you will immediately begin thinking he's teaching a class on feet and seconds. And feet and seconds are totally worthless to what we are doing here with swords. And I use measure and tempo because everybody talks about measure and tempo, but everybody translates it as time and distance. I don't want you to think in feet and seconds. Your brain will lock up and fall apart. It does not matter if I can reach 70 inches or 80 inches. It only matters if I can reach that guy. And so, you know, sitting here with a tape measure under my arm and say, well, from this point right here out to that point right there, it only matters if I can hit that guy. And that could be 10 feet or 12 inches. It doesn't matter. So, if measure and tempo are not based on inches and seconds, what are they based on? And the answer is we have to go back to a system of time that is much older than we are used to thinking in and much newer. And what I mean is most of us here today in our 20th century selves look at time from an 18th century perspective. It is made up of tick-tock, tick-tock, and that's all that matters. There's an atomic clock somewhere clicking out those seconds, and that's how we view time. When I say that we are looking at something that is much older and much newer, the time that happens during a fight is relativistic time, which most people don't think of. Einstein thought of it. We're moving towards it. You think about it every day if you're an astrophysicist, but we don't really care about it in our daily lives. When I say that it's much older, it's also based on Aristotelian time. Good old Aristotle. Believe me, this gets to fighting in a second. I have to go through all the schlog and the backstory to get to the aha moment to make it make sense. So Aristotle didn't have fancy clocks. He simply had the observable world. And he said if you take a scene and there is no motion in that scene, and you have somebody sketch that scene, and you paste that scene next to a window where that scene is, there's no way to tell the difference between the scene if it's perfectly sketched and the window, as long as there's no motion. Without motion, there is no time. Now, Aristotle was a smart guy. He knows that no matter how still you hold, how little this rock moves, the sun still moves, my heart still beats. But for a reasonable approximation of the universe, without movement, there is no time. Time is simply a measure of quantity of change. So, if I'm standing perfectly still, ignore my head and mouth, there is no time. Time passed during where it took the rock to fall from my hand to the ground, and then time stopped again for all practical purposes. If you take a fight and you've got two fencers and they're standing there squared off, all right, cool, and they're not moving, they're kind of doing that thinking thing, and then one makes a motion, the other responds, and then they stop. And this goes on for a while. You could film this whole thing, send it off to a Hollywood studio, and they could edit out all those pauses. So all you got was action throughout. This is how most action movies happen. And that is the actual fight. All those pauses are not germane to the fight. For a fighting purpose, thinking might be useful, but they don't actually affect the physical interaction between two fighters. So you ignore those stillnesses. I'll come to a tempo of stillness at a certain point, but that's later. They effectively don't exist. So where does this bring us to measure and tempo if they're defined by motion? That means that a measure is the amount of time that it takes to make a motion, and a tempo is the amount of time it takes to make a motion, and a measure is the amount of distance or range that can be covered in a tempo. So they're self-referential. They fold back on each other. It gets kind of goofy. The nice thing is that it works really well because it meshes with the way our brain looks at body movement. Much better than a stopwatch does. So you get into a point where you have two people, they're squared off, they're facing each other, they're not moving. Now, this is where it ties into relativity. Einstein's theory of general relativity says that at that point, they are stationary relative to each other. Okay, cool. That's, that's high school physics. And if you take both of them and you put them on a train, and the train, me and my opponent, are facing that way, and the train's moving 30 miles an hour that way, and we're both standing in the same car, and we're both moving 30 miles an hour that way, we're still stationary relative to each other. Okay, that's pretty basic stuff. And if I, train or not, start advancing towards my opponent, then we are in motion relative to each other. But the fun part is, no matter what my legs are doing, if he's moving backwards at the same speed, we're once again stationary relative to each other. You can, if you look at a lot of fighting manuals, notice the wrong foot's forward. There's all these sort of artistic problems, mostly in old German fight books. The Italians kind of started to get the footwork right, but a lot of the time the footwork was kind of ignored. They drew what the body and the hands were doing, and then kind of stuck a generic pair of legs underneath. What we're looking at is the fact that from here down, unless you're kicking somebody,